Welcome everyone to this special broadcast from the E-FWD studios. We'll be exploring critical dynamics facing the university sector and the wider energy industry. My name's Patrice Burnside and I'm Head of Delivery for Policy and Education. Today I'm joined by Professor John Underhill, University Director for Energy Transition and Professor of Geoscience at Aberdeen University. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret. John's one of the originals, a founder member of the E-FWD community, which exists to help deliver a secure, clean energy transition. Hear from John now as he takes on a range of questions about the relationship between academia and industry, all of which have been put forth by E-FWD members.
So I've been really pleased to be part of E-FWD in its first year, being a founding member. Why did I opt to do that? It was the opportunity to meet a broad spectrum of people. What I have found is that perhaps some of them would be initially sceptical or think that university was relatively irrelevant to the subject area. I've appreciated the opportunity to table points, questions, and for them to hopefully see that actually academia, in being independent, a reliable witness, and if you like, having the safe haven for a convening power for meetings and discussions, makes that the university system and those of us that are trying to address the interdisciplinary challenge of the energy transition and oil and gas's place in it. I found the E-FWD forums and the tent discussions to be very valuable in that regard.
That's excellent. So let me go to that list of questions that we've got. Being so member-driven, we appreciate the contributions and the desire from so many of our members to engage effectively with academia to help solve the challenges of the transition. So somebody has wanted to know about the university sector's role in research in terms of whether you could give us some examples in carbon capture and storage.
Yeah, so carbon capture and storage is one of the four main areas that we have expertise and experience in. So we have carbon capture, utilization and storage. It's quite important to stress the U in CCUS as well, I think. We have expertise and experience in wind power, obviously in geothermal energy, and indeed in hydrogen and storage thereof. So those are the main areas. Now, in terms of carbon capture, utilization and storage, we've been doing screening, geological screening for trying to identify the best sites for carbon stores in places like the southern North Sea and elsewhere on the UK continental shelf. And it's almost a traffic light system to show that all the geological elements align for areas that are green for go, or orange or yellow for proceed with caution, or red, wouldn't go there for carbon storage. Now, there's such a spatial squeeze in the offshore for wind, for hydrogen, for carbon storage, oil and gas operations, and I could go on, fishing, environmental protection areas, shipping lanes, the MOD, that actually you look at the North Sea and you think, actually there's a wide open space for offshore wind. The reality is much more complicated. So if you put a wind farm over a carbon store, you can't necessarily easily measure, monitor and verify the carbon plume with injection. And it might actually be two different companies or joint ventures. You have an oil and gas company or a carbon storage company looking after the CCS bit, but the wind farm might be a completely different developer with a different partnership. So again, you can end up with insurance as well as technical challenges. A wind farm operator with a fixed wind farm to the seabed may not actually be best pleased that the subsurface directly beneath their feet that they have not got any control over is storing carbon. And what happens if a well leaks? So what we've been trying to do is to look at the screening to work out which sites should have primacy, and then try and have a dialogue and a discussion so that different stakeholders realise that there are competing challenges for that offshore real estate. So if we're going to meet as the UK our targets, and you often hear politicians and policymakers talk about the good news, the UKCS has 75 or 78 gigatons of carbon storage available to it. And in the same breath and often the same sentence, they will say, the good news is we've got 50 gigawatts of offshore wind. But for the reasons I say, we have co-location challenges. If you can't find technologies that allow both to operate in the same area, the one, other, or perhaps both will be knocked out, and then we won't meet those targets. So we've been doing a lot of work in that particular space to screen and try and identify the best and most robust sites for carbon storage, and try and future-proof a horizon scan as to what happens after the Track 1 and Track 2 projects. We're going to need a whole set of projects taking us forward if the UK are going to meet those targets. And before we know it, we might find the space has actually been taken by other technologies. So doing this work early is really, really important. And it's the geoscience and engineering piece there that's largely driving it. But of course, you then have to go into the business models. Does CCUS wash its face commercially? Is it waste disposal? Does it make money? Or does the emitter pay? And that makes the commercial model, because if you've got, let's say, the cement industry in the Peak District, the Peak Cluster, that faces an existential crisis because it's emitting, and because of that, you may not get private equity support, not be able to get banks financial support, or indeed insurance. They would like to keep those people employed. They would like the cement to keep being produced. So that might cause them to reach out to a carbon storage site. For instance, Morecambe Net Zero, Mnet Net Zero with Spirit in the Irish Sea. And then the question is, can we get a transport link? So a pipeline between the Peak District and Barrow Terminal and into Morecambe. So there's a lot of different elements that need to align to actually deliver some of these things. And we as a university are seeking to do the basic research and then to challenge and look at to integrate the other elements to make sure that a project is deliverable and is commercially viable. I think that it's a very polarized world, and maybe that reflects, the broader society today. Where I come from is actually, you look at the UK currently, that whether we like it or not, and the sort of inconvenient reality is the starting point on our journey to energy transition is the UK still relies on oil and gas, no longer coal, but oil and gas for 75% of its primary energy consumption. If we look at global numbers, it's 4/5, over 80%, and that includes coal as well as oil and gas. So it's a really challenging starting point to go from where we are today to where we need to be in the energy transition. And for me, one needs to have all those elements in the room rather than, if you like, we all have an aspiration to go from where we are today to a decarbonised net zero world. Very laudable, very good. What it needs to be is a journey, not an event, and a true transition and not a cliff edge, because if it's a cliff edge, we will close things down. We might decarbonise, as we've done with coal mining and coal-fired power stations, but it also leads to things like Grangemouth, Port Talbot, questions about British Steel's facility in the Humber region. That would lead to unemployment, deprivation, fuel poverty, less energy security, and actually for the needs that we have, we would just be exporting the carbon footprint, which would be higher, whilst the UK meets its carbon targets and forcing that down. So for me, all those things need to be tabled and have an honest, open and transparent conversation in which all that is present. What I do find is that quite often those difficult questions, or even the inconvenient reality of our starting point on that journey to transition, is omitted from the conversation. I'm very proud to be part of a community at Aberdeen which has that full bandwidth and inclusivity where everything is on the table from, okay, how do we decarbonise oil and gas? And I think it's our role as well to hold industry's feet to the fire, to say, well, okay, no flaring, potentially carbon storage, and offshore electrification would force the carbon footprint of our indigenous oil and gas to a lower extent, not necessarily completely climate compatible, but certainly more compatible than importing LNG, liquid natural gas from Qatar, Algeria, Peru, because that has a higher carbon footprint, and even more so importing fracked gas from the US. And we're very reliant, of course, on gas connections to Norway,
Yes.
and for about 30% of our gas import
Yes.
needs. So all these elements, I think, need to be put on the table, addressed, and work out what is the best solution that doesn't lead to fuel poverty, to unemployment, and leaving communities behind. And that community piece is really essential as well, because I think we need to ensure that we have an open dialogue and have the social license to talk to communities who might be worried about, I don't want carbon stored beneath my feet, I don't want wind turbines here, or pylons for the grid as we basically rewire Britain for the transition. So the community engagement and the social science aspects are also important here.
And these are the conversations we love having in E-Forward. The university sector is so important because it brings together those pieces of skills, the future talent pipeline, and understanding the finance picture as well and the challenges that exist there, and being a very productive kind of agent of change and kind of conversation, facilitating that, bringing people together to understand that holistically. So let me go to another question from our members. One person would like to know about plugging and abandonment in terms of it being key to decarbonization. What are your thoughts on this?
It's an absolutely key question, great question, because wells that were plugged and abandoned 40 years ago, absolutely compliant with the regulation at the time, but never with the thought at that time that the site that they targeted for oil and gas might actually be reused, 40 years later for carbon storage. Now, carbon dioxide has quite different properties from hydrocarbons, from oil and gas. So in terms of oil and gas, it's a hydrocarbon, it's long-chained, so a long molecule is very, and is inert. Carbon dioxide, by contrast, is a very small molecule and is also very reactive. So CO2, carbon dioxide, plus water, H2O, becomes carbonic acid. That is aggressive against some cements that would be in legacy wells. Also, carbonic acid is something that corrodes pipes. So have we got the pipes of the right steel? And indeed, fields like Morecambe, like Miller, and other fields in the North Sea that have natural CO2 within them, all their facilities had to be built with chrome-plated pipelines and terminal facilities. So the question would be, are the wells that were plugged and abandoned from oil and gas in the past, are they appropriate in terms of the steel and in terms of the cement? And if they're not, then we would have to remediate them, and that comes with a lot of cost. And that might break the business model for that CO2 site. So indeed, plug and abandon are absolutely crucial in the CCS space and decarbonisation, because we need to identify any wells that potentially could be straws to the seabed that would be leakage pathways. And therefore identify them and say that's an area where at best it's sort of the orange amber light or potentially a red light to progress. However good the site is geologically, we need to weave in the well integrity piece as well, and the spatial planning that I mentioned before, in order to get a holistic view about where are the best sites to do this. And again, that's where I feel a university has a role to collect the data and forensically analyse the evidence, come up with the interpretations and the maps, and then share those widely, whether it's with the regulator, the NSTA, the Crown Estate Scotland, or a wider community of stakeholders, many of which are involved with E-Forward. So there's an understanding and a technical, data-led, evidence-based approach to decision making. So where I see us playing a role is that in technically informing policymakers and decision makers about some of these issues, of which plug-in abandoning is writ very large in the North Sea. We don't want some of the early carbon storage projects to have leakage, because people will say to us, you don't know what you're doing, as the industry and indeed academic partners. And quite rightly, if that were the case, if we knew something was potentially vulnerable to leakage through well integrity, through plug and abandon, you can't unknow what you know, and we must table that and address it to make sure the right decisions are taken. And in so doing, the projects which are most robust will progress.
Yes.
And those that have got challenges, be that to well integrity or cost, we should pause.
One of our members would love to know, have we got the appropriate skill sets to do these activities? Let's talk about upskilling and reskilling people to face the energy transition. What are your thoughts?
So a lot of the existing skills translate across, map on very well to what we need for the energy transition. But let me take that example that you mentioned before of plugging abandonment and the fact that carbon dioxide is very different from an inert long-chained hydrocarbon. That might mean that somebody working on plugging and abandoning wells might need to have a greater skill set or depth of knowledge, deep dive into chemical engineering for the reactivity with cements and the like, or indeed other corrosive properties that carbonic acid have with steel, to think about, okay, how do we do it differently? So I see it as additive. It's not tearing up the playbook and totally designing courses and the like. It's standing on the shoulders of giants of what we've done now, but adding and making sure that it is aligned with what industry's needs are and what the general demand for the energy transition to be delivered is.
Okay, fantastic, John. So talk to us then about the role of partnership and collaboration in the university sector. I think you've got some very interesting examples to share with us.
There are ever diminishing amounts of money for research. Then you can imagine that people in different universities, particularly the funding model that universities have, that they're going to compete for that rather than collaborate. But my take on it actually is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. If we take Scotland or the UK, I think by pooling resource, we should be humbled that whether it's Aberdeen University or another university, we don't do everything. But actually by working with other universities, then there is a greater offer to be made. So as you may or may not know, over the last 10 years, I've led something called the UK Centre of Doctoral Training. That's a pan-UK initiative with 12 universities. We've had something of the order of 170, 180 PhDs enrol over that period. 110 of them have now graduated, all 110, 100% have been employed in a relevant discipline, which suggests that this is a good model to have. And this is where 12 universities are collaborating. What made that possible was the initial funding came in was a central pot, and rather than keeping it to one university, my hosting university, I felt it was really important to ensure that this was a truly collaborative effort. So there are joint projects. We also worked with industry to co-design some of those projects to make sure that they were relevant, and there wasn't duplication. So we had a research committee look to make sure that the same project wasn't being done by two PhD students in two different places. The other example I'd bring to the table is of the National Energy Skills Accelerator. What is that? It's where 3 higher and further education institutes here in Aberdeen, so Aberdeen University, RGU, and North East Scotland College collaborated into a partnership called the National Energy Skills Accelerator. We then worked with Skills Development Scotland and ETZ Limited with a view to looking at our capability of what we did currently compared to what industry and others said was needed in the energy transition for skills. And what we realised that actually there were some nice complementary strengths, but also some capability gaps which we sought to fill. And we went to the Scottish Government and put a proposal to their Just Transition Fund, and were awarded £1 million so that we could put on free courses for those that are either unemployed or those that were currently in employment but wanted to reskill or upskill and hone those skills to face the transition. And over 700 people have taken those free courses in order to upskill and reskill, and then gone on to be much more competitive in the employment market and indeed been recruited to do energy transition jobs. For me, geoscience and other disciplines, be they engineering, law for regulation, business, social science and so on, absolutely crucial that we have the right practitioners and we are able to attract them that will actually address the energy transition And these are the people that we have to attract in schools, into university, and show that energy is an exciting and attractive career pathway to follow, and effectively inform and educate them that they can do two things. One is to help us in terms of keeping the lights on, keeping the heating going, but also be instrumental in saving the planet, in decarbonising the existing energy system, and take us on that journey and avoid the cliff edge and make sure it's a true transition to a decarbonised, low carbon energy system, which is still reliable, still has the energy security that we need, is affordable, and yet environmental sustainable and climate compatible. That is, for me, is a really exciting place to be. But are we telling that story well enough? And I think organisations like E-FWD are a great opportunity to try and articulate that, and to see if we can excite the community to be our ambassadors, to ensure that people are realising as they come through school and other parts of education that they can make a material difference by taking a career in energy.
Thank you so much to John Underhill from the University of Aberdeen for being with us today. For more information about E-FWD, please visit efwd.energy. That's EFWD.energy.